All right, so it is the last Thursday of the month. That means that it is time for a new exclusive. And today we're going to be talking about something that I think is incredibly important, and that is how do we actually bring all of these buzzwords and all of these things that everybody's talking about really loud together and say, okay, that's great. We should be doing all this stuff. How do we do it? What does that need to look like in our learning ecosystem? And by learning ecosystem, I mean, what are all the tools and platforms and things that we need to have in place in the organization in order to support the things that we're saying we want to do? And if we can't do that, then we're going to have some trouble. And we'll talk a little bit today about why it's not going to be buy one tool to rule them all. There are a lot of decisions to make and a lot of things to consider about how this works in your company. So today I am joined by Tracie, Kareen, Josh, JD, and Rob, and everyone that we invited today to have this conversation. I invited because all of these folks have a lot to say about different factors that play a role in what's driving changes to the learning ecosystem. And a lot of what some of us do is work with organizations to make these decisions to help them figure out what they do need and how to take the next step. And so I'm really excited that you all were able to join us today. Thank you for coming. And I know we only have 30 minutes. So we're going to do the best we can with this time. But to get us started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a model, and this is something that Corrine recently put together. This is a diagram that represents what we believe are the drivers that are influencing our learning ecosystem today. There are lots of components in this diagram. There's getting better skills data. There's how do we get content and assessments to folks? How do we make sure they get coaching? How do we make sure that they're able to practice through experiential learning? Marketing tools. How do people know these things exist? Tracking and delivery. How do we make sure that we're getting the stuff to people that they need, and how do we track it? Where does the data go? And how do we analyze that data in any meaningful way? So these are some of the things that are driving the learning ecosystem today. And buried underneath all of this are additional drivers like the needs of the business and AI and how are we automating things differently and resources and those kinds of things. So I wanted to start off just by asking the group, of these drivers, do you see any of these that are maybe newer than others? Because when I looked at this diagram, I was like, I feel like in some ways, I feel like we're talking about the same types of buckets, but just in a slightly different way. But that might not be true. So, what do you all think about these drivers? Is there something missing that you would add, or is this look right to you?
It looks perfect to me. No, I
It looks
can't.
perfect to green.
No, and I will say in thinking about this, and maybe I'll just start by giving a couple caveats. One, intentionally put no arrows on this because, which we'll talk about today, like a lot of the ways that these systems interact with each other are very specific to the organization that you're serving and the needs that you're serving. So I'm sure we'll dig into that. But the one area, ironically, that I left out at the beginning and then added in in an iterative process is skills, which probably everybody here is shocked about since that's what my book's going to be about. But I do think that skills data is a new type of data that can help inform and drive a lot of the other pieces of the ecosystem and hasn't been seen historically as its own category or its own standalone thing.
What do
So
you think that is different, Kareen, about the skills piece? What did we used to do and what should we be doing differently?
I'm sure JD will say that frontline workers, folks have been doing skills for a long time. They just didn't call it that thing. But I think most organizations have not have had the level of depth or insight into their workforce's capabilities. One, because we didn't have systems. Two, because we just didn't have the mechanisms in place to think about or address workforce skills in that way. And so while I think that's one reason why it didn't exist before, there's a new urgency to have this level of data because of AI and a lot of the decision-making systems that want to make more data-driven decisions. And L&D hasn't historically focused on that type of data. It's focused on learning analytics and learning activity data. So there's this connective data bridge between learning activities and business metrics that really exists in skill data that I think can start to better support a lot of the AI functionality that's starting to be considered and implemented to make better people decisions. So I think that's why, but it's a bunch of things are converging at the same time that I think is making skills more important as we move forward and a consideration for L&D and how they build out their ecosystem.
Yeah, I would summarize this to the age-old problem in training where people focus on here's all the stuff you need and not thinking about what they need to do. And there's this mismatch, right? We're not clear on what people need to do with information, and so we just dump a bunch of information on them. We're like, you need to complete things, not what are you going to do with that information. But I think to your point, Corinne, that doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't happen in every environment. And when I started in this field, I was working in call center training, and we had this stuff down to a science. It felt like we knew what people needed to do. We evaluated them constantly. We were very involved in all of their performance data. All of that was intertwined with what we were doing in training and performance support. So it was really shocking to me to come into some organizations and that be very opposite of not being that tied to the business need. So I think that's really interesting to think about being clear about what skills you're trying to develop and why people need those skills. I wanted to throw this over to Josh because a lot of folks are saying, okay, it's going to be fine because the robots are going to do it for us. So, talk to me a little bit about what you see as far as how's AI playing a role in changes to this learning ecosystem? Where do you think it does well? We should be considering where this can play a role, and where is it like, we need to focus on actual intelligence here.
Yeah, it was interesting just taking a look at Corinne's work here and trying to like place it in my head. Like, where does all this sit? And this is very much within the learning ecosystem. And I think a lot of the influence is starting to go higher upstream with just the overall business ecosystem down to human capital management. And so why is that? Why is that a concern? And a lot of that has to deal with how AI is showing up within those systems. For instance, whether you're on a Microsoft or Google Workspace, the way that AI shows up in there has a direct impact on the performance of the associates, whether they have access to knowledge or even doing a transcript within a meeting. It changes the way that they do work. And same thing down in the human capital management system. Who's tracking skills? Like, where is that coming from as a source of truth? And we finally get down to Corinne's work here, and there's severe impact downstream all the way through. And I think organizations right now are trying to wrap their arms around that. And it's an incredibly difficult problem just because functions that need to communicate to have all of these systems work lockstep are not in place. Or organizations are trying to figure that out along the way. So I think we have our eye on the prize in regards to the data. Like, we know this information is critical to make proper decisions, but to wrangle these sources of truth as things are changing at the same time is a problem. And I think that's
Yeah.
where we're at.
As you were talking, Josh, I don't see a lot of folks focusing on data at all. And the conversations I'm seeing, they're like, look at this tool, it can automate this. Look at this tool, it can automate this. Look at this thing, it can do this for you. And I'm not seeing a lot of people talking much about data. Tracie, you do a lot of work in learning ecosystems with the folks that you're working with. Talk to us about, are you seeing that as a gap too? Or is this something that you're seeing folks focus on?
I'm seeing this as almost a liminal space in the industry as a whole because there's a lot of faith in the capabilities of AI. And Microsoft just sent out a research report on how Copilot can determine skills. But if you actually look at the research design, it is the most poorly designed research study I've ever seen. It's like asking a 5-year-old to rate how well they clean their own room. It has holes in it really badly. But Microsoft holds a lot of weight with businesses. So they're going to read the executive summary, think that they can easily do the skills data, because when they think of data, it was something that was just long, big projects. And especially skills. Think back to the late 90s, early aughts. Like if you did a skills project, you were bringing IBM in, and it was like a 6 to 18 month engagement to build skills. And then you rested on those laurels for another 5 to 10 years. There is no way you can be a productive business today with that. And I think there is this friction of moving from that model to a newer model when AI is not quite there yet. Like they want to depend on it to get the speed and to move, but it doesn't understand the nuance. And especially if you go to frontline, it does not understand the nuance because people change the interaction every time.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't. So they struggle. They really do, because they either want to spend months or minutes, and there is no in between. And we've got to find that in between to actually make a successful learning ecosystem.
For sure. What say you, JD? You're working a lot with Frontline. Do you think that is true, or what are you seeing?
Sorry, I was Googling liminal space. We have to be careful with the use of the term ecosystem. It's one of those words that I think if you ask people across the industry what that word means and how it strategically informs the function of learning and development, I think you're likely to find wildly different explanations and or levels of kind of familiarity and application of the term and the concept, which is not unusual for the function. I think the key is that we acknowledge and embrace the idea that the ecosystem of performance and learning exists. Regardless of what role you play today, how effective it might be, it's already there. People learn how to do the job all the time without the involvement of a formal training function for the most part. The challenge here is how we effectively integrate the right capabilities into that ecosystem to improve the outcomes and the capabilities of that existing system, because it's just the kind of interconnected nature of work is what we're playing with. And that, if done correctly, should help the L&D or talent development function break out of the silo of the function as a support entity that's over there, that whole the business thing. That should go away. And then in practices, in data, in hardware, in software, it should make this idea of help people do their jobs more effectively part of the job story. And I think the danger is that we think about ecosystem in the context of what this function is and what we do, and then we accidentally build out a more complicated version of something that's already sitting separate from how the job is done day to day. And that's the risk. So I think, again, not just because I work with frontline employees all the time, I think there's a lot to learn from the way the frontline workforce and the frontline work environment evolves, how certain things are embraced, how data is used. There's a lot of interesting things you can take away. And right now, I think a big takeaway is that you're seeing a rapid consolidation of capability, tools, hardware, software within the frontline space, one for efficiency purposes, one for cost savings, but one because the work is so well defined and the needs of the workforce is so well defined, we're able to start pushing the pieces together in a way that wraps around the reality of how the job is done every day. Because frankly, if you don't, you're just not part of the story, right? The workforce on the front line is not going to change for any support team, inclusive of HR, learning and development. You have to fit into their world because their world is how the job is done. So I think that's the key, is making sure that we have a consistent understanding and kind of practice around this idea of ecosystem integration. And the idea is bringing what we can do to help people perform closer to the ecosystem that already exists versus trying to construct our own.
I want to
Yes.
touch on something that JD just said, because I think it's actually so critical for people thinking about this, that the industries, the roles, the areas of the business where the work is already clearly defined and there are mechanisms in place to assess people's performance are way ahead of any other industry, business, or function. because the systems that are now available rely on that insight, understanding, and data to be able to function effectively. JD has had a front row seat, and I think rightfully so, to a lot of the very early opportunities for innovation, because he's working with folks that unknowingly, or just because of the nature of the businesses that they were running and the work that they do, have more transparency, visibility, and measurable data that they can leverage for these systems. Everyone else is realizing they need that data,
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
don't have it.
Tracie, I know you dropped a comment in the chat about starting to use the terminology tech stack or technology stack versus a learning tech ecosystem. And that definitely holds true for what we've seen to be helpful as well. I actually wanted to throw this question over to Rob because Rob is the tech guy, the back end nerd. And Rob, you've done a lot of integrations with technology. And one of the things that we talk a lot about when we're trying to map out the quote unquote learning ecosystem is what is all of the technology that you're using in the organization and how are things flowing in and out of the learning function in order to support the business. And one of the things that happens a lot that we see is that the tech that is in the training space, the L&D space, does not play well with other things. It is very boxed up and doesn't like to play very well with other things. So, what have been some of your experiences with this, and how do we do better?
So yeah, to echo that point and to echo something that Josh was saying about these things all talking to each other, there is a point, and my diagrams do end up with a hell of a lot more arrows than anything, because I'm always concerned about what's talking to what and how is that data going to get to this thing. And if we throw an AI in, AIs don't work in a vacuum. They need data sources to make analyses, and then do decision making based on that data. So where do we get all that from? And I think that's the thing that I find the hardest thing in any kind of tech stack or ecosystem, if you want to call it that, in any combination of things that lead to an outcome, is how do we marry all these things together? How do we get them to talk to each other? How can we share that data in a standardized way to something that can do analysis properly? And then, of course, are we even doing analysis properly? Are we analyzing only learning data? That has very little impact of anything other than how people are doing with the learning. So being able to access actual performance data, on the job performance data, usage data, people's feelings and feedback, that kind of data coming back into that ecosystem, I think is going to be more and more critical once we start seeing these AI kind of ideas and analysis machines. They need that real data to say, hey, here's the pattern that you're missing. Here's what good performance looks like. Here's how we get to good performance. Here's what we're going to get more of. And then you give them the keys to create content, and bingo bango, things get a little bit easier, but there's still humans in that chain.
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I hear people say to me in a snarky way is, oh, XAPI is only good for you improving your designs. It's not good for determining whether people learn. There is an element of that that is true because of how people implement this stuff. They just implement it to track like what to Rob's point, what's happening in the content. There is a much broader opportunity to tie those data together into performance for sure. But to your point, Rob and JD and everyone on this call, frankly, if our goal is to support business outcomes, then how can we improve how we're supporting business outcomes? And the data that is in how are people using this? Is it effective? How much time are they spending in it? Are they repeating, coming back to these things? And then some follow-up data that we can get from folks, some qualitative data to ask them, why is this something that you're coming to often? What is helpful about this? And getting into some of that actual helpful information so that, yes, XAPI is helpful to help us improve. Getting that data about what our stuff is important. If you're making a whole bunch of stuff and nobody's touched it and you don't have the data to know that, then I promise you, you are at risk for that, all that being cut. I wouldn't pay for it in my company. And so why would you build a bunch of stuff that nobody's using? So I think that it's a both and. We have opportunities with data and playing a role in that data picture, that broader data picture, but we're going to have to learn some things. We're going to need some new skills. or some new resources in the organization. And I would say maybe not or, and some new resources in the organization. But I think that I want to take a few minutes to talk about, is buying a tool the answer to that? Should I go shopping for a tool that does it for me?
I have a problem with buying a tool until you have fallen in love with the problem. And you can't fall in love with the problem until you learn to ask good questions. Because that's where you get meaningful data. And that's when you can solve those problems. Why are we doing a new onboarding? Because we need to reduce 90-day turnover by 10%. Okay, 6 months later, we've evaluated that if you get 60% through the onboarding program, we've reduced turnover by 17% across the organization. How can we do that? That's one of the things, like, I love tech. I am a magpie personally, but not when I'm with clients. I want to find the problem, ask good questions about how they know it will be successful and what that success will look like and where we can point to it qualitatively and quantitatively, and then give them a variety of some tools. But like just jumping straight to a tool is a recipe for disaster. You barely have enough money to do it once, let alone correct it.
Yes, that you could not have said that better. I think that anyone who's ever been through a project where you're implementing a new technology, the point where it fails is when you go with a shopping list of features without the problem that you're trying to solve with those features. It's, I think I need to have this and this. So with this conversation today, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this conversation for XCL is it build capable. We've done learning ecosystem analysis for a long time. The reason we built XCL was because there was a gap in the technology that was available for us to collect good data and for us to get things to people in the flow of work without that clunky extra screens, not accessible, whatever in the world people are trying to do elsewhere. And I'll try not to throw people under the bus with that. But I think that that doesn't mean that you go out and buy XCL and that's going to solve all your problems. Like, I can't show you an ecosystem and be like, this is all you need now. Now, I know we talk a lot about you probably don't need an LMS if you have XCL. In a lot of cases, that's true. But I can't conclusively say that for every single person in every single situation, because I need to know, what tech stack do you have? What are you trying to do? What are you problem you're trying to solve? What data do you need to show that you've demonstrated that? And where are your gaps? And until I know that information, I can't make any recommendations. So when people ask you, what's your favorite tool? What's your favorite platform? I can't tell you that without a whole lot of context. There are some that I think are better than others from a service perspective and a reliability and accessibility and some of those broader things. But what's best for your organization is going to take some work of you deciding where are your gaps and what problem are you actually trying to solve, Tracie mentioned. I wanted to leave a few minutes, so we have about 6 minutes left. Corrine just mentioned this earlier, and so did you, Rob. We were going to today consider showing you some different ecosystem maps for different companies. This is what a learning ecosystem map looks like. And I can pull one up and we'll do just a quick screen share. While I'm pulling this up, I wanted to ask you all, you mentioned a few times, like every time I do an ecosystem map, there are arrows going everywhere. Can y'all speak to that? This is open for anybody, but I know Corrine and Rob, you both mentioned it.
I can speak to why I put arrows everywhere, because I'm a nerd, and all these pieces of the map, there's a flow of data somehow. And being a nerd that's done a lot of integrations, I know that's where it's going to break down. And I like to see where that data needs to flow in or be available to other things. And little arrows start to show, for me anyway, how complex this is getting. And to your point of what tool is best, what tools do those integrations for me? Nuance is everything when we come to an ecosystem and the individual components of it. And I find that some tools have an opinion of how they get used. And if that opinion works with the opinion of the organization's needs, by all means, that's the tool for that situation. And then the integrations can come separately. But arrows and the flow of data are really critical to understand from a perspective of how the system's working, where problems could start, and where we're going to run into the biggest barrier to have success there, like performance data not being accessible to the system. Now we've put a human in the way, and that's going to cause time delays. That's going to cause potential error. Or if we can't get learning data available to some other system that needs to do analysis, that's another kind of gap where we're maybe going to have to export from one system, import to another. There's a lack of automation, things like that. So those arrows, that's why it's full of arrows. And I just love arrows.
I think, Rob, like when I think about integrations, and I think about organizations that have invested in LMSs, most ecosystems have some hub and spoke model, right? Like that there is some source of truth from, and let's be honest, most of the information that's passed back and forth is just data. So if I'm looking at all the arrows, I'm trying to figure out which systems, where is the source of truth for a particular type of data? What other systems does that data need to be shared with? And does the sharing need to be bidirectional? So is there something that's happening in another system that then comes back and informs the original data source? The challenge right now in evaluating any tool or looking at anything that you might invest in from a technology perspective is every technology has their own opinion about whether the hub or the spoke and what data they generate and store and want to be the source of truth for, and what they're willing to or able to share with other systems and where they integrate. I think one of the things that is interesting with the AI kind of spike happening is that AI doesn't care so much about those boundaries anymore, and it just wants to share information everywhere, proliferate it. And we have technologies today that are not set up that way. And I will say this from a former vendor position. Technologies were built to protect data so that you continue to pay for that technology. And so it's really,
No.
right? There's a whole, that is a business model of if you are the source of truth for a particular type of data, then you become valuable to an organization and then they need to keep paying for you. And hopefully the data is valuable. But I think a lot of those models are being challenged because of the questions that are now able to be asked and the complexity of data that people need to answer those questions. Like the demand for integration is only going to increase.
Yeah.
And so it's going to put pressure on a lot of platform models and specifically data models that have previously existed. So anybody who's looking at technology today should be thinking about and asking those questions around the integration piece. And there's no right answer to where the source of truth should be, but you need to have an answer for where is your data source of truth and how do those systems integrate?
For sure. And this is actually a learning ecosystem diagram. I'll just show y'all for the last minute that we have together for one of our clients. And we worked with them. I think this project was from 2022, I believe. It's not that long ago. But in this ecosystem map, what this diagram shows is all sorts of components from the business. It's not just like this LMS LXP function that they were trying to do an RFP for. It was also like, we deliver webinars, we host videos in Wistia, we have all these e-learning authoring tools, we have this SSO, we have this invoice management system, we use Salesforce, we use a loyalty program, we have a portal where all this stuff needs to go. Had XCL existed when this project happened, we would have been able to use XCL to meet their use case, because what we ended up doing is we ended up they got a really incredible LXP. It's expensive, but they had to spend a lot of time with integration work trying to get content into the LXP and then find a way to deep link to it on their web portal, which is where people actually went, without knowing they were ever in the learning platform. And so they were trying to have this headless experience, meaning that I don't know I'm in a different platform when I'm on the website, but still be able to track everything and know what's going on in that content. But in order to figure out that was even the problem that they were trying to solve for, we had to map out that entire tech stack, not just what kind of content are you making and do you want to do, I don't know, simulations and bobbly head videos. That wasn't the question at all. That's all in support of what we're trying to accomplish. I will stop sharing. We are at time. We're actually a minute over, but thank you all so much for joining us today. We all acknowledged on the call today that we needed way more time than 30 minutes to talk about this, but I'm really glad everybody came together to talk about some of these impacts that are happening and what are some of the decisions. I think where we landed is that you really need to do the work to map out your current ecosystem and figure out where you're trying to go and work with someone who can help you figure that out and map that out for your future learning ecosystem, your modern learning ecosystem. JD wrote a book on it, which is very brightly colored, and he's holding up now. Check out the Modern Learning Ecosystem from JD. Check out the skills book. I don't remember the full name of it. It's got the long marketing name.
Building the skills-based organization.
Building the skills-based organization. Josh has a book on AI coming out. Oh, it's like a book club. What's your book called? What's your full title?
Applying AI and L&D from platforms to performance.
And so, see, you have 3 books now to go take away from this. We are going to be posting a white paper that has that little model that I showed you at the beginning. And Corrine did a good job of drilling down into what all that actually means for the learning ecosystem. So I will share that out on LinkedIn, and you are always welcome to reach out to me directly. All right, cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.